Hello class. Today I'll be going through South of My Days, Judith Wright's poem. I'm going to be talking about how it fits into the Module C rubric, particularly for this poem, how it fits into the nature of the remembered landscape. One of the things that I've often encouraged is to read through her poetry and listen to some bush sounds as you do. Now this is something that some people find a little bit off-putting, but I think listening to some bush sounds gets that feel of the Australian landscape insofar that it often talks to us through those sounds and the birds and those sorts of things. But let's get straight into it. So looking at the title, South of My Days, immediately I think what we get here with Judith Wright's poetry is that sense of the past. And I think South of My Days here, rather than her other poem, Moving South, which deals with her own old age and growing older, I think South of My Days here deals with the nature of memory, that it's our past and our sense of memory that is so woven into how we imagine and feel within landscapes. And if you can think about your own past and childhood, I'm sure you have some vivid nostalgic memories. And I think a lot of the imagery in this poem actually builds that sense of nostalgia. Okay, so the first stanza, we deal with the outside. We deal with Australia's natural, real landscape. Okay, so the very first line, South of my day's circle, part of my blood's country. This first line obviously talks about her connection to the land. And I think part of my blood's country immediately gives that sense of the familial connection. That it's not so much that she feels at home in this land, she also has that familial bond with the landscape. And the use of the word blood there is quite significant, that the way this landscape moves and the way it grows, so too does she grow with that same sort of blood coursing through her veins. The second line we have is rise that tableland, high delicate outline of bony slopes wincing under the winter. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, the tableland here is the Atherton tablelands up in Cairns, and her imagery often deals with movement across the Australian landscape, not just up north, but also moving down to the Hunter and those sorts of areas. Even within this poem, she talks about the movement from Charleville to the Hunter, or at least obviously spoken through the stories of Old Dan, which we'll get to in a second. But, you know, these are places that she's lived, that she's come to know and understand. But I think the first stanza, what it gives us is this outside world. I think in the context of the Module C rubric, it's very much a real landscape. So high delicate outline of bony slopes wincing under the winter, low trees, blue-leaved and olive, outcropping granite, clean, lean, hungry country. So her imagery here actually juxtaposes the landscape with the weather. Okay, and she does quite a lot of figurative descriptions in her poetry where she often personifies, you know, the seasons and the land and the weather. But here we get this obviously quite delicate, as she puts it, outline of the land. It talks about bony slopes, and I think this really shows the devouring nature of the landscape. It shows that Australia is a place that's quite arid, I think, and we use the word fecundity, okay, which really means, you know, the way in which a place produces, okay. So how fertile is the place, in other words? So from the outset of this poem, of the outside world, we see a landscape that is quite harsh, that obviously is lacking in that sense of fecundity. But I also think it's a place that, you know, is interesting because she feels at home there. It's her family's country. It's her country. The creek's leaf silence, willow choked, the slope of a tangle of medlar and crabapple, branching over and under, blotched with a green lichen. Now, what I think is interesting in here and with a lot of Judith Wright's poetry is the way in which she integrates British symbolism with Australian symbolism. And she talks about that actually in an interview where she talks about being a symbolist poet, the issues she has with, invoking British colonial symbols as well as Indigenous Aboriginal symbols. So willow trees, obviously British symbols here. But I also think the use of the word choked is quite significant in that little taste of her own sort of cultural ambivalence or connection there with the land, that it's actually quite difficult for her. And that's, I think, an image, a level of imagery that's built up quite a bit in For New England and her other poetries. But I think the connections that are evident throughout all of the poems that you look at in Module C for Judith Wright show that sense of ambivalence or the worry that she has with being connected to those two cultural worlds. Now, the last bit that we get in the first stanza, which I would very much describe as a real landscape, though it uses quite a bit of figurative language, it really paints this great image of the real landscape in terms of the weather wincing under the winter, and the landscape that actually tries to hold back the struggles that is the weather. But we finish with, and the cottage lurches in for shelter. And this allows us to transition into the next stanza, which takes us inside, okay? So the cottage becomes personified with the use of the word lurches there, the way it sort of tucks itself and hides itself away inside the landscape. And, the blotch with green lichen just shows that how the nature of the landscape grows around and over the top of. And I think when you look at some of the post-colonial work in terms of Australia's natural landscape, and I think this one, Ghost Gums by Paul Williams, is a great one that looks at the way in which landscapes grow over and consume. And I think the darkness in this is a very good one in thinking about the way in which Judith Wright shows the oppressive nature of a landscape, that it's not always welcoming, and even though she has that familial connection, it's one that's quite daunting to her, that there's that sense of the landscape growing over and consuming people. So the second stanza here transitions to being inside the cottage. And it's important to note here, while it's a small one, the use of O here is what we call ekphonesis. Okay? Double check I've spelled this. Nope, it doesn't recognize the spelling. Ekphonesis is the sort of dramatic expression that we get using O or OH. So it's often to denote that sense of dramatic expression, probably a bit of melodrama there. But here, what it does show us is Judith Wright's personal voice that's being used here. So, oh, cold, the black frost night. I think it gives that feeling of Judith Wright, shivering, saying, oh, it's cold tonight. And why that's significant is because it helps us mark the return of Judith Wright's voice later on when we come back after the storytelling of Old Dan, when she says, oh, they slide and they vanish. And I'll come to that in a minute. But the use of the ekphonesis here really shows Judith Wright's personal voice. So the walls drew into the warmth, and the old roof cracks its joints. The slung kettle hissed a leak on the fire. Hardly to believe that summer will turn up again someday in a wave of rambler roses. So this imagery here shows how inside the cottage is very much influenced by the outside landscape. The walls draw into into the warmth. So that personification of the cottage is extended there. It continues. And the old roof cracks its joints. So we get this sense of age, this sense of living in this landscape for a period of time. The slung kettle. So you've also got some Australian symbols here. Hardly to believe that summer will turn up again someday. Now, in this particular part, we have the personification of summer, and it's interesting how summer and winter are juxtaposed here. So wincing under the winter up earlier, and then summer as turn up someday in a wave of rambler roses. And if you're unfamiliar with rambler roses, they look something like this. So what it does show is that juxtaposition of the seasons. I think it also shows the sense of life. So if you can think of the first stanza showing that lack of fecundity, that lack of producing, and a landscape that is, here is lacking in life, or is quite, as she puts it, delicate. The second stanza brings in summer as one that things come to bloom. And I think you can look at that as a symbol of life. I think you can look at it as a symbol of time passing. But certainly this second stanza obviously demonstrates that sense of time passing and of living inside this cottage. Okay. Now, here's where I think the poem becomes quite unique, and I particularly love this poem for the way that Judith Wright incorporates the sense of Australian storytelling. So when it finishes there, thrust its hot face in here to tell another yarn, a story old Dan can spin into a blanket against the winter. So old Dan is a microcosm for Australian storytelling culture. And a microcosm really is just basically that old Dan represents broader society. It represents the way in which Australian society, outback society, builds this sort of nostalgic world of storytelling and of, knowing the land through those stories. And the links there, I think, can be made in the line before when it talks about summer turning up someday in a wave of rambler roses, thrust its hot face here to tell another yarn. So even summer tells another yarn. So I think here you've even got, a illustration of how stories are woven into the landscape. Yeah, so I think that's quite significant that not only is it the stories of old Dan that we see a representation of Australian storytelling culture, but also that it's a big part of the landscape. That's a big part of how we understand our sense of place. And the following two lines there with that repetition, show that sense of time and time passing. So I think quite interesting within a lot of Judith Wright's poetry is the way in which she uses that imagery around time. It's something that we see in Train Journey, that on this, long train, a lot of time passes. And we often call this, we call this temporality. In other words, the experience of time, or worldly time. And I think that, 70 years of stories he clutches round his bones, 70 years are hived in him like honey. Time here, or the experience of time, is one that's obviously, there's that sense of nostalgia, but there's also that sense of these stories are what he holds to, these experiences are what he holds to as a sense of comfort and security. Okay, and that imagery of clutches around his bones. and hived in him like honey, shows that the stories represent his own sense of comfort and security. They allow him to feel that sense of place, that sense of belonging. Okay. And obviously you can talk about things like the use of the simile there of old honey and how people collect old honey, just like the collection of stories, and to build that sense of place, that sense of comfort within the landscape. But here's where we hear old Dan's voice. This is what I think is really quite unique in poetry, because we don't just have the voice of Judith Wright. In the following two and a half stanzas, we have the storytelling of old Dan. Sorry, I think that should be up here. Now, so the following stanza: droving that year, Charleville to the hunter, 19-1 it was, and the drought beginning. 60 head left at the McIntyre, the mud round them hardening like iron, and the yellow boy died in the sulky ahead with the gear, but the horse went on. So we've got old Dan's voice is not one of eloquence. Okay, old Dan's voice really demonstrates that Australian colloquial slang. So 19-1 it was. Hear the voice of old Dan. Okay. In his own storytelling, he does obviously depict the harshness of the Australian landscape. 60 head left at the McIntyre, and the yellow boy died. So it talks about obviously death, that the landscape has the ability to take from us quite drastically. It also shows that level of harshness within the Australian landscape. But particularly what I think we find with the voice of old Dan is that perspective of stoicism. Okay, that his voice represents Australian outback perspectives of stoicism. Now, to be quite stoic, and that sense of stoicism is to be somewhat unfazed. It's to be quite reserved and composed in the face of such hardship. It's a perspective that we see in a lot of Australian painting, post-colonial painting, and where figures within the landscape often standing amidst dust and ruin, and have this sort of stoic disposition, this face of emotionless expression. And I don't think it's that they lack emotion, but it's just that they've been so hardened by these extreme conditions. So his imagery here obviously talks about the hardship of droving, of moving cattle and livestock. But the horse went on. So here you also have that sense of Australian resilience. Okay, so that perspective of stoicism is also that sense of resilience, that it's not caring, but it's just that sense of being hardened by the landscape and being resilient amidst the harshness of this landscape. It was the flies we seen first, swarming like bees, came to the hunter, 300 head of 1,000, cruel to keep them alive, and the river was dust. So his storytelling there obviously talks about droving, but what I think is quite interesting is the symbol of dust. And I've always thought that dust is a very dynamic symbol, because it has its grounding obviously within biblical allusions, from dust we were born, to dust we shall return. But I also think dust is a symbol of death and returning to the land, as well as the nature of the Australian landscape as one that's often harsh and does not provide much life in that sense. So here you could say symbol of dust can be either biblical or demonstrative of life. So we continue with Old Dan's storytelling, and I think this part is quite interesting because we get a few different symbols. We've got the bogongs. If you're unfamiliar, the bogongs obviously are the moths that used to be eaten by Indigenous Australians, as well as the Cobb and Co coaches. So you've got those really idiosyncratic images, those symbols of Australia's outback identity. Okay. And in his storytelling, I think the most important one there out of all of them is the symbol of Thunderbolt. Okay. So Captain Thunderbolt here. Sorry, should use capitals. Is obviously an illusion. And the allusion to Thunderbolt, I think, shows a lot of the nature of those sort of outback myth making and storytelling. It's really got that sense of storytelling that's woven into our national identity. And you need only look at Ned Kelly and see how ubiquitous he is in the way in which Australians conceptualise the outback, that you can understand how important this image is to the sense of Australian storytelling and how important that is in the way in which the landscape is understood and appreciated. So Thunderbolt at the top of the hungry hill, and I gave him a wink. I wouldn't wait long, Fred, not if I was you. The troopers are just behind, coming for that job on Hillgrove. So here his storytelling, I mean, it's recognised that this isn't perhaps factual. And we look back at earlier when we open to his narrative voice, when it talks about yarn spinning spin a story in a blanket. The spin here is really that his storytelling is a work of fiction, but I think it's such a big part of appreciating the landscape and storytelling inside an old cabin, inside an old cottage, that make us feel at home. But I have got the images of of Captain Thunderbolt here in a painting by Tom Roberts, and it's a bit hard to see, but you can see Captain Thunderbolt here with his horse in a shootout in the rocks. So, I mean, I look at this particular painting and I often think of old Dan imagining himself somewhere in one of these rocks, giving him a wink and telling him, go, make sure you run for it. The troopers are just behind. So his storytelling is obviously quite unique in that he injects himself into the myth of Thunderbolt, but it's obviously a work of fiction. Now, here's where I think it gets quite significant, because we see the end of the storytelling of old Dan here, perhaps at the ultimate moment where it seems quite fictitious. But with this use of ekphonesis here, it demonstrates the return of Judith Wright's personal voice. Oh, they slide and they vanish as he shuffles the years like a pack of conjurer's cards. True or not, it's all the same, and the frost on the roof cracks like a whip. So from the beginning, it's almost like her return is, I wouldn't say dismissive, but it's almost like just saying, oh, this is such a big part of our, old Dan's life and his stories. It reminds me a lot of my own grandfather and the way he used to spin stories and tell imaginative stories, all of which were quite fake, false, I should say. But I think this imagery here, as he shuffles the years like a pack of conjurer's cards, and if you can imagine a fortune teller who uses the conjurer's cards, it's almost as though these stories, these memories, are played out like a game of cards, or played out like cards on a table. And as he shuffles them up, he shuffles up the stories of his past, all these memories, and he just plays them out on the table, or plays them out as he sits there in the cold winter cottage. True or not, it's all the same, and the frost on the roof. So I think this little part here is that while it's a big part of our memory, while it's a big part of the storytelling, there's obviously elements of imagination. And the link to the rubric here would be the Imagine landscape. So, sorry, I should put up here the remembered landscape. So, as a summary, I suppose, to old Dan's storytelling, as likened using the simile there of a pack of conjurer's cards, we see that his sense of nostalgia and memory, but that following line there, true or not, shows that it's a big part of his sense of imagination, that it's not all the truth of Australia's outback, but it doesn't quite matter. And she acknowledges that too, that true or not, it's all the same. It doesn't matter whether it's real or not, because the stories that are built around this landscape, the stories of his own past, are what keep him warm in winter. They're what keep him comforted. Okay? And the frost on the roof cracks like a whip, and the back log breaks into ash. So you can think about looking into a fire as the log breaks, and that sense of staring into that fire as you tell stories. Wake, old man, this is winter. So this short truncated sentence here, I mean, it's got quite a few of techniques here you could use, but you've got the short truncated sentence. You've also got a highly modal expression, and I would also say it's got that imperative language, even tone. Wake, old man. It's almost wake from your dreams, from the half dreams of storytelling and sleep, of imagination, memory. Wake, old man, this is winter, and the yarns are over. No one is listening. Now, the big thing I think about this last line, and I think it feeds into that sense of wake, old man, is really, I think we should ask that as a question. Is no one listening? I think it's the act of saying, not that no one's listening, but that we often don't listen to it as a true story. Okay? I think on one hand you can say no one is listening, yes, because what old Dan says he's just saying for himself, for his own comfort. But I often think that last line there, no one is listening, and I think often when old people tell us stories of the past, we often give them our ear to listen, and to offer them that gesture of hearing their stories. But we don't listen to them as acts of truth, or as stories that are true about the landscapes in our worlds. We listen to those stories because they give us comfort and they make us laugh and those sorts of things. So I think this one here is quite dynamic. This one I think is interesting because the big one I ask myself is anyone really listening? I mean, you can look at that line and say, yes, I think, we do listen to these stories, but we don't really listen to them as truth. Or you can look at that imperative language there of saying, wake, old man, no one is listening. These are just the ramblings of your old past. Okay, so I think that final line is quite dynamic. And the last little short stanza we get here is obviously the use of the cyclical framing device. Okay. south of my day circle. So it reminds us that this is the memories, this is the past. Okay, we come back to that same title, South of My Days. I know it's dark against the stars, the highland country, full of old stories that still go walking in my sleep. Now, what I think is significant about this final line is I think it actually incorporates all three elements of our Module C rubric. I know it's dark against the stars, the highland country. So here I think reminds us of the real. Okay. It reminds us of the real elements of our landscape, the darkness of night, the stars, the highland country. It also tells us then that our memories play a big role. And the last one there, still go walking in my sleep, I think also shows the importance of our imaginations. So I think it's that final nexus between the three, that final connection between the real, the remembered, and the imagined, that I think make this poem quite unique. And there's quite a bit in that last two stanzas there. But looking at this poem as a whole, it deals a lot with the remembered, as evidenced through this analysis. It looks a lot at the past and through our sense of nostalgia. But I think that last bit there, the last two stanzas, also tells us the importance of our imagination, that we can't really rely on our memories to understand the landscapes, understand our sense of place in the landscape, that a lot of it is a work of fiction. It's a work of, of us embellishing the truths of our past, or even inserting us into certain myths and legends that aren't quite real. And it's perhaps why I really love this poem, because I think it deals with a lot of those intricacies between, memory, truth, imagination. And I think it works fantastically as a Module C poem that you could potentially analyze on the day. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this analysis.